Today, we are talking to Ella Hickman, who's the principal of Hickman Family Lawyers. And Ella is our Starts at 60 legal expert. And today we're going to talk all things grey divorce. So getting divorced in your 50s, 60s and 70s. Welcome, Ella.
Thanks for having me, Wendy. It's lovely to be here.
So can we maybe start off by just asking you, what are you seeing in your practice in terms of older people getting divorced?
Yeah, anecdotally, I can say that I've seen a real upward trend in relation to, well, in reference to people getting divorced or separated in their 50s, their 60s, their 70s, even their 80s. I've had some clients recently, and that's always interesting to me that people can often get that far and then they're wanting to be separated because, you know, a lot of the things we see as problematic for people when they're younger and getting separated, you know, it's a very different set of issues that can often lead to a separation when you're over 50, I think. But I'm certainly seeing more of it now.
I guess we're all living for longer as well.
So, I think that's part of it. Yes, I think that's part of it.
So how is divorce different, you know, once you're in your 50s to 70s, or I guess as you've just said, you know, your 80s? How is it different?
I think the biggest one probably is for most people, they don't have sort of the young children aspect of things, which can be like a highly emotional thing to go through and to deal with when you are perhaps in your 30s or 40s going through a separation. Not to say that some people in their 50s and 60s don't have young children that form part of that, but that would probably be the biggest issue. The second thing I would say is that the makeup of your assets and how you've been living your life often looks quite different when you're getting older. So things like, you know, the longevity of your income that you might have going forward, that's much, you know, bigger issue for people when they are in their 50s and 60s and approaching retirement and thinking, how am I going to make this work with, you know, if we do separate? Because I work with a mediator who always says no one gets richer in a divorce. And it's really true, because you've got this asset pool that all of a sudden you're going to carve it up in one way or another. So no one's going to end up with all of it.
So what would be your advice to, I guess, prepare, as much as that might sound like a weird thing to do if you're looking, you know, down the track and thinking that's where, you know, things might, I guess, end up? So how do people prepare for a divorce in their older years?
I think one of the best things you can do is try and have an understanding of what your assets and liabilities are, because I think for most people, if you are separating, you're financially, that's probably people's biggest concern, and they've often been used to living in a house perhaps without a mortgage, or, you know, they've got money in superannuation that they're looking to use for the future. But for a lot of people, and I will say particularly women, this impacts women more than men, have a bit of a limited understanding about what is there. And I think if you can have a bit of an understanding, so that when you do come and get some legal advice, or maybe financial advice, or advice from an accountant perhaps, you can give them that information so that you can start to form a picture of how you might make things work if you do decide to separate, because it's a very overwhelming and scary thing to go through a separation. And I think even more so when you think, where am I going to live? How am I going to pay for my groceries? How am I going to, you know, can I still assist my kids if they need help? All of these things that perhaps during the relationship you haven't had to worry about, or haven't been the person who's primarily dealing with those concerns, or those things that some of us deal with day to day. I think that's a really good place to start. So surrounding yourself with a bit of information, and from there potentially starting to get some advice around, you know, either from a lawyer or from an accountant or a financial planner to help you moving forward with those types of big decisions.
Fantastic. Sounds like a lot to think about, but also good advice. So then what would be the number one mistake that people make, you know, when they're approaching or dealing with, or find themselves in the scenario of dealing with a grey divorce?
I would say the thing I see the most is people making assumptions about what they can or they will get, or what they won't get. You see a lot of people having incorrect information around things like superannuation, for example. So just because one person may have worked a lot more during the relationship and added a lot more to their superannuation, that doesn't mean necessarily that the other person isn't entitled to part of that, or that's not theirs as well. And I get a lot of clients coming to me and saying, oh, I understand that's their superannuation and I can't touch that. And I sort of go, well, actually, that's not correct. And in lots of cases, my clients, by the time they get to me, have whipped themselves up into a frenzy because they made assumptions about things, or they've listened to a friend or a colleague or something who has just not given them the right information. And then by the time they get to me, I'm saying, just take a beat. This is actually going to be fine. You're going to be fine out of this, but let's sort of challenge some of these ideas you have first, because I think as well for people, when you go into having discussions with your partner about how you might divide things up, if one person is saying, no, you're not entitled to this, or that's mine, or you didn't contribute here, that's a really damaging thing, probably for both of you if you're both relying on that information. So I think that would be my biggest thing, is making those assumptions without kind of any basis for that.
Fantastic. It's such an emotional thing to even for me to imagine, but for everyone to deal with, I guess, as well. So you've kind of touched on it a little bit when you mentioned superannuation, but is there any tips or anything else that you have to advise around how asset distribution works at this stage of life?
Yeah, I think it is quite different because for lots of people, you might not have a mortgage anymore. So for younger couples, we see, commonly, you've got a house with a mortgage, you've got some superannuation, which you're a long time away from accessing probably, and you might have some other bits and pieces. Whereas as people get older, usually your mortgage has been reduced quite a lot. You're getting closer to your preservation age for your super. So for a couple, say, who's a 35-year-old couple who are separating, you find a tendency, no one wants the superannuation because they can't use it. Whereas as you get older and you get closer towards your preservation age and being able to access it, that's actually a really useful thing for people to go, well, hang on, there's a resource there that I can access perhaps some cash, or, draw that out in a different way that can actually support me or pay my rent or help me get into a new property, or financially that's a good way to support me. And so if one person does decide to stay in the family home, sometimes you will find there's quite significant super there that people can access and say, okay, well, that's what I'm going to use to establish myself somewhere else. And that's something that we might often say, let's get an accountant involved and talk about the best way that you can draw that down on that, because again, lots of people haven't thought about that. But I would say a house without a mortgage and your super are probably the biggest differences there. I would also say that's a really tough thing for people, is to get their head around the thought of having to potentially move out of their family home, because particularly in Perth at the moment, we're seeing a really buoyant property market. I know it's the same mainly throughout most of Australia right now. So you're seeing people that maybe 30 or 40 years ago purchased their first home for not a significant amount of money by today's standards, and then you're talking about houses that might be worth $2 or $3 million, that the bulk of people's wealth is locked up in those properties. So all of a sudden you start having to have these really tough discussions around, one person might not be able to keep the house because if they do, then the other person is kind of going to dip out there. So having some really tough conversations around this house that you might have lived in for a really long time and raised your children in it and have seen your grandchildren come through it and everything, that you might not be able to keep it. And that's as you said before, when really emotional time in general. And then when you start saying to someone, this might not be realistic, and it is for some people to keep their house. I don't want to be all doom and gloom, but when you start having to have those conversations, that's a really hard thing for people to grapple with.
Absolutely. So on that theme of difficult conversations and difficult things to grapple with, do you have any tips? Obviously you've worked with a lot of different people. Is there any advice or tips on how to, I guess, break the news to family, or how to move forward with family and friends going further? Because again, there's a lot of water under the bridge and a lot of years together with family and building families and with friend groups. So do you sort of have any advice from your experience in that regard?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think particularly with your children, so older children, it's really important to be upfront, because the way you might be able to get around it with a 4 or 5 year old child is going to be very different to the way you might deal with it with a a 30-year-old child or a 40-year-old child in those, as the case might be. So I think being upfront and open with them and having those conversations, if you can sit down with them together and have that conversation, you might find that that's better for both of you. What people don't want, and I do unfortunately see this, is sort of factions splitting off and one child aligning with themselves with mum, one child aligning themselves with dad, and then you've really got this sort of this family conflict which is bigger than just what's going on between the two of you. I think in some respects that's unavoidable, but if you can try and align yourself somewhat and have that conversation together, then I think that's a lot better. Particularly, you might have grandchildren and all the rest of it, and we see really sad, things where one grandparent is no longer seeing the grandchildren or no longer seeing their children, and that's going to make a difficult time even more emotionally draining and hard. I think other advice would be potentially consider who else might be a bit of a stakeholder in this, because again, with your children, as you get older, it's not uncommon to have potentially given your children a leg up into the property market, or that you might have parked some money in an offset account for them to help them out with their mortgage repayments. So sometimes, unfortunately, they can also be wondering how they might be impacted in this. And unfortunately, sometimes it's the case that they also might need some advice in that stage as well, because this can get a little bit messy, a little bit complicated. And people, of course, when they've got more skin in the game as to how that might affect them emotionally or financially, or even care arrangements for their children that you might be assisting with, these are all things that are going to make it more difficult for them as well. I think the friends question that you asked is a really tricky one, because usually as we go through life, we do have those couple friends that have been a really solid and core part of your group and your community. So I think, again, being honest with them, trying not to badmouth the other person, as much as sometimes that can be really difficult and we are all overwhelmed by this process and emotional. If you go to your mates and say, oh, she's being really difficult or he's being awful, and I don't think it's going to stand you in good stead, probably with your friends, but not for the other person either. And you don't want to cut off each other's access to support in that time, because as you get older, your parents might not be there anymore. So there's a way that, there's a support system that you perhaps don't have, or that's not as readily available to you, because they might also be older and have their own challenges. Your kids, as I said before, have their own stuff going on as well. So try and be kind to each other. And it's really easy to say, but it's something that, from my experience as well, we are much likely to get things done in an amicable way, and much more quickly, much more easily, much more cost effectively as well, if you're being kind to each other. If we can get you in a room and mediate things and try and resolve things, as opposed to going down to the family court. In WA, the delays at the moment are somewhere between 3 and 5 years to resolve something, which is completely out of control. I don't think anyone should be going into that system at the moment unless it's completely unavoidable. But if you're in your 70s, the thought of spending the next 4 to 5 years in that system, surely there's no one that would think that's a good idea, surely.
No, absolutely. Ella, it's been such great advice from you today. It's, a lot to think about, but I think the number one kind of takeout for me just from this very brief conversation is, I think, get advice. You mentioned that as lawyers, you might get an accountant involved, and that you understand from your experience when that, might be recommended, and that the difference between what people read on the internet or, Dr. Google or whatever, whatever the version is.
Yes, the legal equivalent.
Yeah, the legal equivalent. So, I think that's my number one takeout from today. And certainly as well, the other one is be kind to each other. And yeah, so that's fantastic. Thank you, Ella Hickman from Hickman Family Lawyers. Thank you so much for your time today.
No worries, anytime. Happy to help.